Hi, my name is Sydney Hughes, and I am a senior career counselor with the Career Center at CU Denver, and I am presenting today on leading as an introvert. So just to get started with our agenda, what we're going to be talking about today is first, I want to give some background on what an introvert is. I want to talk about introversion and extroversion and the similarities and differences between those. I also want to talk about this idea called the extrovert ideal and what that looks like. And then we're really going to focus on defining leadership and talking about how introversion can have an impact on our leadership capabilities. So if you're watching this, I want you to just think about first. I'll say if you came to this video, you probably are an introvert yourself, as am I. So I want you to just jot down, what are 3 words that people use to describe you? If somebody got to know you or is an acquaintance of yours, maybe not a best friend or family member or something like that, but somebody that you've known for a little bit of time, how would they describe you? For me, I think people would say that I'm very focused, sometimes shy. Maybe I hear cool, calm, and collected a lot. So go ahead and write down 3 words that somebody might use to describe you. And I'll let you go ahead and pause there. And then we'll keep going and talk about our introversion and extroversion. So I'm a big fan of the Myers-Briggs assessment. And usually these 2 words are the first focus for anybody when we go into that, because it's kind of common vernacular now, common language that we use. But what I want you to do is take everything that you've learned about introversion and extroversion so far and just throw it out the window, get rid of it. Because I think there are a lot of things out there. There's a lot of different definitions of these 2 words and what they mean. And I don't think that everybody has a grasp on what these things actually are. A lot of times I hear with introversion and extroversion, how much you want to interact with people, or how much you like interacting with people, or how good you are at it. And it doesn't mean any of those things. Introversion and extroversion has to do with, where do we get our energy from? Where do we focus our attention and energy? Do we get more energy from being around people? Do we get more excited? Are we more lively? Do we have more energy and motivation? Or do we get more of that motivation by being by ourselves, by reading a book, by maybe going for a walk, by listening to some music, but not interacting with other people? So it's not about how much you talk or how well you communicate or how much you interact with others. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It's about, where do you get that internal energy from? So when we talk about our extroversion and introversion, our extroverts are the ones who really tend to kind of act before thinking. So they are comfortable just jumping into something. They have a thought and it immediately has to come out. So they are the ones who usually need to kind of talk things through first when they're deciding something. It actually kind of helps them sort out their thoughts. If they can say it out loud or voice their thoughts, it helps them work through it. Our extroverts are also the ones who are usually comfortable raising their hands in class. So if you've ever been in one of those big lecture halls, if a professor asks a question and you see hands go up, those are typically your extroverted personalities, because those are the people who are comfortable raising their hands in front of a crowd of people. But it's more about, they asked a question, I have another question, or I have an answer to that, and I need to say it out loud right away in order for my brain to kind of process those things. So it's usually kind of more helpful for them to be able to talk through that if they're able to voice it out loud. They get more energy from that. They tend to be very expressive when they're talking, probably use their hands. You may even see an extrovert like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And then they kind of talk to themselves to kind of work through and figure out what that's going to look like, because that also helps them kind of work through the ideas that are going on in their head. And they tend to kind of brainstorm with people in a group setting. So if you've ever been on a team, or you're working on a group project or something like that, your extroverts are typically the people that are like, well, let's just go to the library and we'll just kind of talk through it. Let's just figure it out as a group, because they process things a little bit easier when they can just brainstorm and be around other people. Our introverts on the other hand, tend to think before acting. So for introverts, it's all about being able to kind of process internally first before something comes out of their body, before they voice something. So they tend to prefer more time reflecting, more time thinking about it, and being more kind of calculated and strategic about what they say out loud, because they do their best processing up here. So if we go back to that example of being in a lecture hall, we're all probably introverts here, right? It's probably your worst nightmare to raise your hand in the middle of a 150 person lecture hall. That sounds mortifying, right? Because for an introvert, it's like, well, I need time to process first of all before I'm going to raise my hand. Like, I need to process the question. I'm probably going to read through the book to figure out if I can find the answer somewhere. I would even lean over to the person sitting next to me before I'm going to raise my hand in that huge lecture hall and answer a question, right? And then maybe say, throughout that class that you're sitting in, you have a question afterwards, right? You're probably going to schedule office hours to go and talk with your professor rather than raising your hand in the middle of class, because we need that internal kind of processing time, and we're not typically comfortable being able to do that in front of large groups of people. A lot of times introverts will like to write out their own thoughts, kind of collecting them. So being able to, process things up here, but maybe write it down, make lists, have Post-it notes, right? Whatever we need to do to kind of keep all of that information organized. And brainstorming, I would say, is also an introvert's worst nightmare. So if you are on a group and somebody says, hey, let's go to the library and just kind of brainstorm and figure it out, introverts are like, wait a minute, I need some time to prep. I need to know what we're going to be talking about. I need to know when we're talking about it. I want to know what the steps are ahead of time so that I can come prepared to talk about things in that meeting. Because if you just hit me with it right away, I haven't had any of that time in the back end to think it through first so that I can participate and be an active member in this conversation. So for introverts, it's really, they get more energy from being able to think, being able to focus on their own thoughts, and not having any other outside interaction affecting that. So I love this analogy of batteries. So for extroverts, they get their energy from the outside world. So they get that from interacting with people. They get that from, could be things like going out in nature. It could be interacting with pets or animals or things like that as well. But they get their energy from the outside world, interacting with the outside world in some way. Whereas introverts are more like a plug-in battery source. They get their energy more internally when they have time to kind of disconnect and pull away from what is going on in the outside world. So I like to use a lot of examples from my personal life because my partner and I are almost polar opposites in terms of our Myers-Briggs type. So one very stark difference for me is when you come home at the end of the day, right? What does that look like? If you have roommates or if you have a partner or family members or whoever, what is your interaction when you come home at the end of a long day? So for me and my partner, I'm very introverted. He is very extroverted. And so when we come home and we've had a long day of, I've had a lot of student appointments, I've maybe presented, I've talked with a lot of people. He's been in meetings all day, probably large conference rooms where he's kind of connecting with other colleagues on things. So when we come home at the end of the day, he is jazzed. He has so much energy. He's like, this was a great day. I got to ask this person about this thing, and I had a great conversation with this person about this, and blah, 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 right? It's all kinds of things that he's like, I want to tell you all about these things that happened because I'm so excited and I had such a great day. And for me, I'm like, man, I'm tired. I am exhausted. I have been talking to people all day. I don't want to talk to anybody else. You're great and you're amazing, but I cannot talk to you anymore because I am just burnt out. I'm just wiped and I've talked with too many people. So I think it's important to understand that introversion and extroversion, we'll talk about it today in terms of leadership, but if you're ever interested in talking about what that looks like in your relationships or what that looks like in your classes or how that affects your career choices, please come and see us in the Career Center because it really is an aspect that can inform so many different parts of your life. And I think it's important to just have that recognition for where those things show up so that you can adjust as you need to. Okay, so one of my kind of catalysts for creating this presentation is because I read a book called Quiet. And if any of you have not read this book yet, I highly recommend it. It's by Susan Cain, and the tagline in here is "The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking." And every time I read this, it gives me chills because I'm just like, God, that feels so accurate to me. There feels like there's so much noise sometimes in the world. And as an introvert, that can be really hard to navigate. It can be hard to figure out how you get your own space versus how you participate in the world and kind of move forward in your leadership or your career goals in this world that sometimes I think can feel a little bit foreign to introverts. And so I read this book and I was just fascinated by it. And I really want to kind of dive into some of the ideas that she introduces in here that I knew, but I didn't put two and two together until I read this. And I think it provides some good context for how we can think about leading in this type of a space. So in this book, she talks about the extrovert ideal. And so she really kind of starts the book off by saying, when we were in kind of early 1900s, right, hundreds of years ago, we shifted from we had a kind of a cultural shift from this culture of character to this culture of personality. And so she tells kind of some stories in there about how we made this shift. But the culture of character was really like the ideal self was somebody who was serious, who was disciplined. And it really like it mattered more how you behaved in public and how you showed up in that space more than your personality characteristics or what that looked like. And in the 1900s, we started to see this shift into a culture of personality where it was no longer just about like, your work ethic or kind of, getting the work done or having a solid business or whatever that looked like. It started to focus more on how people were perceived. What did people think of you when you showed up in that space? How are you captivating them? How are you entertaining them? So we started to have this shift into people developing different types of personalities and showing different types of characteristics in public. And so we saw this big boom of business. We saw a lot of urbanization. We saw a lot of people kind of congregating in areas because they wanted to be around each other. So we no longer, like, we started to see less of people being spread out and people trying to kind of come into geographically closer areas so that they were able to connect and kind of live into this culture of personality. And so this story that she mentions, she talks about a young farm boy, and I'm going to read this because I want to tell the whole story. So she talks about a young farm boy who one day attends what's called a Chautauqua speaker event. So there were, during this time, these events that would happen, and people would come from all over the place to listen to these speakers. And so he goes to this event, and this was an initiative that would send gifted speakers across the country on lectures on literature and science and religion. And people would come again from all over the place to hear these. So on this day that he goes to this Chautauqua speaker event, he is just completely captivated by this speaker. He is mesmerized and starts dreaming about how he can become somebody like this, how he can move into or become a speaker for these Chautauqua events. And over the course of the next 10 years, this farm boy continues to work on his presentation skills, and he presents at Chautauqua, he attends college, he begins pursuing a career as a salesman. And after selling beef for a few years, he decides to begin teaching courses on public speaking. And overnight, the class is a sensation. And he later goes on to start his own company that's dedicated to helping people become more confident in their speaking and relationship building abilities. This young boy's name was Dale Carnegie, and he is one of the most world-renowned authors and influential speakers of our time. And this metamorphosis from kind of salesman to public speaking icon is the rise of what we call the extrovert ideal. It is when we shifted from this culture of character to people appreciating the individual and the personality that comes with that. So what we have seen in this kind of extrovert ideal and moving into this culture of personality is that our society has continued to evolve, and our societies continue to kind of favor this extroversion. So a lot of the things that Dale Carnegie teaches in his book is how to win people over, how to look people in the eye, shake hands, have a presence, like captivate people, captivate your audience. And so this kind of snowballed into creating a lot of institutions that are designed for extroverts. So if you think about our school systems, right, we shifted many years ago from having individual desks, and we would be in rows, desks are probably totally foreign now in school, but beside the point, we used to have kind of rows of desks, and now they're all in little pods. It's usually pods of like 4 or 5 desks, so that kids can talk with each other while they are learning. So it's designed to kind of increase that group communication and participation. Same thing with workplaces. I work in an office that is considered a shared workspace. And so we have a large open area where there's all kinds of different cubicles and we're all kind of mismatched together. And then when we need to meet individually with somebody, we have private rooms that we can book out. But the idea is that if we're in the shared kind of collective workspace, we can, communicate, collaborate, connect with each other much more easily and be able to share ideas. Now we can imagine that for introverts, it's tough. It's really hard. And as an introvert, I'll tell you, it isn't my preferred work environment. My preferred work environment is here at my house, at my desk with the door closed, my dog in the background, quiet. It is my space. And I know nobody is going to come in here and interrupt that. And so these spaces that we have created are really designed for extroverts. It is designed for a society that is focused on interacting with each other as much as we possibly can. And so it makes it kind of hard for introverts to say like, hey, this isn't really my preferred environment. I don't want to do this. And so we're forced to kind of figure out our own, way to do things within that. And so this kind of idea behind all of this has become labeled as the new group think, where it encourages employers and universities and high schools and elementary schools in general to think about how we can bring our students, our people together more to develop more of that culture and environment that leads to more success, or so they say. So I want to kind of start to transition now into this idea as extroverts are the only types of good leaders, because that's certainly something that we tend to hear quite a bit. We've developed this social construct that good leaders are extroverts. So for the same reasons as Dale Carnegie, right? He started to figure out like what people tended to gravitate towards. He saw that if he was lively and talked a little bit louder and had a commanding presence and was funny and used a lot of hand gestures and got his body language involved. He noticed that if he did all of those things, more people would come into the conversation. He could bring more people in. And we've noticed a lot of these things with leaders too, is that our society tends to gravitate towards leaders who have that kind of presence. Like, when they walk in the room, they have a confident stance, they have a confident presence about themselves, they can command the room, they speak clearly and concisely, but they have this kind of extroverted presence that typically tends to lead to more promotions for our extroverted people. And we've seen plenty of research that supports that. But my goal today is to say that we can have extroverts and introverts who are amazing leaders. Introverts bring in a different skill set, a different type of personality that can be just as beneficial to an organization, if not more, than our extrovert counterparts. So I want to start thinking about too, just this definition of leadership, because as I was putting this together, I was starting to think about how we actually define leadership. And if I could choose a definition, what would that look like? So I was reading this article that was written for Medium in 2020, where a journalist interviewed CEOs from 14 different corporations and asked them just, what is leadership? Very kind of basic question. And they found that it was hard to describe exactly what leadership was because every definition was different. Some people were focused on the people, some people were focused on the vision, some people were focused on like the results or the goals. And I just think that's an important point that like we don't always stop to think about what leadership is or what it should be and how we would define that. So I've got some examples up here. I'll show you some more examples on the next page. Lots of different ways to describe this, right? This last one, the most basic definition is that you set the destination, right? That's about the goals in the future. A leader is someone who can think strategically, simplify the strategy. Leadership is about being able to drive results. As a leader, you must empower your teams, right? Totally different focus areas for leadership, which makes it kind of hard to figure out like, what is our focus? But this can also help us define what type of leader do we want to be and what does that look like for us? So this is one of the ones that I have liked the best. That says, this was from Forbes in 2013, leadership is a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. So the thing I would like to point out here is that leadership doesn't have anything to do with seniority or one's position within a company. It doesn't have anything to do with titles. It doesn't have anything to do with personal attributes or management. The key kind of elements of this definition are that leadership stems from social influence, not authority or power. Leadership requires others, and this doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be direct reports. It means that we are leading people who could be peers. We are leading people who could be under us or above us, right? But leadership is kind of a 360 view of how we are moving towards these shared goals. The other thing in here is there's no mention of personality traits, attributes. So this could be an introvert or an extrovert that kind of operates in this way. So it's not necessarily just about that title. It's about the person and your ability to influence other people. So I want you to think about here, I'm just going to give you a prompt for some self-reflection. In your opinion, what makes a good leader? So I want you to just take a minute and kind of write down 2 to 3 things that you feel like makes a good leader. What do you look for? What are some leaders that you've had in the past that have done things that you liked? What are things that you've taken away from other people who have led your teams? So go ahead and pause here and write down 2 or 3 things that makes a good leader. So as we continue to kind of research and look at leadership, scientists have continued to think about and research this idea of what makes a good leader. What is that common characteristic or personality trait that makes up a good leader? And they can't find one single characteristic that proves what makes a good leader, but they can find commonality, and that is self-understanding. This is the ability to know yourself, to know how you operate, to know what makes you tick, to know what you like and don't like, to know your career goals, right? All of these different things make up our own personal development and what we know about ourselves. And this is something that introverts do extremely well. Introverts are very introspective. They are very good at having perspective on their own abilities, their own interests, their own personality characteristics, right? Because we do a lot of that internal thinking and we do a lot of that internal processing. And so this is something that we really can utilize when we're leading as an introvert to help us inform how we can lead a team. I also talk a lot about emotional intelligence, and my recommendation is always it starts with you first, right? If you don't understand yourself, how are you going to be able to lead others? And so if nothing else, I think this is a good opportunity today to start diving into this a little bit more and figuring out like where are we recognizing these things and maybe where are some areas where we can look for it in the future. So I'll give you some time here to pause the video again. And I have some reflection questions up here. So when you're thinking about leading as an introvert, leading a team, I know that in itself can sound scary sometimes, right? Being the person in charge is sometimes hard, but I want you to think about maybe having another introvert on your team. If you are leading a team and you have another introvert on your team, does that change your perspective of who you want in the leadership position? Could be helpful to have somebody in that role who understands how you think and how you operate and what you do well and where your strengths are and maybe areas you struggle, right? So I'm going to give you some time here to just kind of reflect on your own experiences as an introvert. So go ahead and pause the video here and then you can come back to it when you're ready. So what we have to remember is that even in a world where extroversion is king, right? Even in this world where we know everybody is extroverted and the society is designed in a way that makes it sometimes difficult for introverts, we bring things to the table that others do not. We bring in a different perspective. We bring in different personality characteristics, and we bring in different traits that can sometimes be helpful. So I'll give you an example. So one word that I used to describe myself at the beginning of this session was calm, cool, and collected. Sometimes that can come off in different ways, as shy or apathetic or whatever, right? But think about it in terms of like the sky is falling. Something happens in your class, something happens with your family, something happens at work. Are you the person then that is cool, calm, and collected in that room? Probably. You're probably the one that can process and let things sink in before your actions start showing. So when the extroverts are extroverting and getting very loud or upset or have a lot of emotions or whatever else might be coming down, you may be that calm voice in the room that's like, hey, we got this. Everybody take a breath. Let's think this through. Let's just sit and kind of work through it, right? There are a lot of benefits to having those kinds of characteristics in many different situations. So here are some things that I think introverts do really well. Introverts are very thoughtful in their words and actions. So because we think and we process before we speak, we're very intentional with what we say and we put a lot of thought behind that. And so when we choose to speak, we can have that authority, we can have that confidence because we've already had that time to kind of process. We tend to think deeply about fewer ideas or projects. So we don't have 1,000 things going on. We may have, 3 or 4 things, but we don't have 10. So it gives us the ability to go deeper into those ideas so that we can produce more quality results in that thought process. We talked about this one, remaining calm in high pressure situations, being able to make decisions quickly about what needs to be done and adapt to circumstances. So again, sometimes that's as simple as just like taking a deep breath, letting something sink in for a couple of seconds, and then reacting. But as opposed to having kind of your emotions all over the place or feeling like you've got too many thoughts going on that you can't make decisions, lean into those introverted tendencies that you have to allow you to move forward. We have the ability to focus on the task at hand, so we don't also often get easily distracted. We're usually very good at focus, able to handle situations independently and responsibly. I think responsibility, dependability, all of those words a lot of times come along with our introverted personalities because we do have that ability to kind of focus and move forward on something. Listening, for sure. This is one of the best things that introverts have or can do. We are such good listeners. Many of you are probably the people who somebody calls when they need, someone to listen, or when someone's upset, right? We're very good at people. We're very good at kind of understanding others, being perceptive, picking up on things. And so just being able to listen and be a sounding board is definitely something we do very well. We think and consider our next move before we act or speak. That's very calculated and strategic, and we can understand the big picture. So part of the benefit of being able to like take a step back and think about things is that it lets us see the whole picture. It lets us see what's going on. So then we can make a more informed decision moving forward. So I want you to think about this and maybe take away or write down the things that you feel like are accurate for you or things that you do really well. And what else would you add? Are there any other things that you do well because you're an introvert, because you have those personality characteristics? What are maybe some of the other things that show up for you? So I think, what can be hard sometimes, again, when we live in this extroverted world, is that we think we have to show people what we bring to the table by acting in a certain way, right? Sometimes we think we have to act more extroverted so that we can show up at the table, or we have to kind of assimilate into somebody else's culture in order to be ourselves. But what we need to show people as introverts, we're in the minority. Extroverts, definitely, we have a lot more extroverts in our society. So what we have to do is show people that what we bring to the table has value. We have to show them how we bring in that value, where we can bring in the value, and what the impact of that is. Sorry, I have a dog in the background, but they're not always going to see that. And so it's up to us to point that out to them. So here are a few ways that you can kind of harness your introversion and really utilize that for yourself moving forward. I would say first and foremost, like communicate what you need. That is something I have learned as I have gone throughout my professional journey, is that no one else is going to advocate for you if it doesn't start with you first, right? You have to set that expectation. You have to set those guidelines about what is going to work for you and what's not. So you have plenty of time to think about it, but make sure that you think about what you need and then communicate that with your line of supervision or your team or whoever you are going to be interacting with. Advocate for your focus time. I cannot reiterate this enough. So I'll give you a last example here. I really leaned into my personality when I came into this position, because prior to this, I was working for an organization where I saw students up to 25 in a day, 25 individual meetings with people in a day. And I'm very introverted. So at the end of those days, I was completely wiped. Like I couldn't put a sentence together because I was so burnt out from meeting with people all day. That's not to say I didn't love what I do. That's not to say I didn't love the people that I met with. All of that was definitely true. But just the sheer amount of talking that I had to do in a day physically drained me. So when I came into this position, you better believe that the questions I asked was, who sets my schedule? How many appointments am I going to be having? What is, my presentation count? I asked a lot of questions about what is my day-to-day going to look like so that I can determine whether or not this is going to be an opportunity for me. And then when I got into this position, I also advocated for I need to have a couple hours every day where I'm not talking to people, where I'm not in meetings, where I'm not doing a presentation, where I'm not meeting with individual people. I need to advocate for what I call focus time. So blocking that into your schedule is really important to make sure that you get it, because if it's open, people will usually schedule over it. But make sure that you have that time. So lots of other ideas in here. Be there for others in tough situations. Focus on what you do bring to the table rather than what you don't. Maybe keep this presentation or some notes that you took through it, and keep that list of skills or strengths somewhere. When you go into an interview, these are all things that you can talk about that you do really well. It allows you to be able to then identify what you bring to a team and help inform them what your ideal work environment is. It helps you decide, right? Just like me, what kind of position are you looking for? What kind of environment do you want to be in? What kind of team do you want to work on? All of those things. So I love to share this list too. This is a list of famous introverts over the years, and you can see I mean, all of these names on here, right? We know all of these, most of us. And they're all introverted, right? So they have been great, amazing leaders in different ways for different reasons, but their personalities were all fairly similar. And so, or their characteristics, and they weren't the extroverted, the outgoing or the outspoken. They didn't have all of those different personality characteristics, but they still made such an impact. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind as you're thinking about going into a leadership position yourself. It doesn't have to be one way, it doesn't only have to be for extroverts. There are a lot of different ways to lead, and understanding yourself and what you want to bring into that space is the most important first step, and everything else will come. So that's all we have for today. This was Leading as an Introvert. My name is Sydney Hughes. Again, I'm a senior career counselor in the Career Center at CU Denver. If you ever want to talk about more personality characteristics or take an assessment through our office, please do not hesitate to reach out. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.